Right, so what I had been asking Grandad was that there was a lot of anxiety throughout Europe and the UK over the actions that Hitler was taking, an increasingly aggressive foreign
Yes, taking
policy.
over Austria and uh, moving to go into Belgium, and
And
but when war started, I was 3 weeks short of 15, and the thing I remember just about then was, of course, the great anxiety. Everyone, it was only 20 years, really, or 25 years since the First World War had finished, and a whole generation of fathers had been in that, and now they were seeing this coming for their own kids coming. And there was and my father that night, the Saturday night, he said, I can't stand more of this news. He decided to go to the cinema. My stepmother said no, she couldn't think of cinema while everything was so bad. And he actually asked me to go, and I was quite proud. And I went with him, and I forget what picture we saw, local cinema. And as we came out, we were walking along to go down and get a bus home. And I said to him, Dad, do you really think this war's going to happen? And he sort of almost stopped, and he looked at me and he said, I'm very much afraid it is going to happen tomorrow, because that is when the ultimatum had been made for the Sunday at 11 o'clock, as you know. They had sent the ultimatum, and the answer had to be back, or the movement of the troops and stuff out of Poland had to be made. And I sort of thought, how strange, war. And we had been told that there would be gas attacks and all that sort of. There were posters out, telling you you don't want war, or people will be gassed and all that sort of thing. And I had left school by then, because all the schools were being moved out of London, and I had actually wanted to go on to art school anyway. But we stayed in London, and then what happened was, for a long time, what everybody called the phony war. And actually nothing happened for quite a while. And my brother was called up. He went into the Navy. And in the first, all the years of the beginning of the war, he was minesweeping in the North Sea. And when I got to be, I suppose, the following year after war started, the Blitz started. And of course, London was badly bombed, as you know. Every night, when it really got going, there were 92 nights in succession that there were bombing raids. And it was pretty all much over London, and you had to go down the shelters. I remember the Sunday morning when war was actually declared, the men were still actually digging a shelter into the house next door to us. They hadn't finished it yet. They were still putting them in private shelters, in the garden. And of course there were public shelters people went to. And you you sort of had to join your local group and take a turn at fire watching, because of the incendiary bombs they used to drop. And you took a turn in your street to watch your street, or everyone in each house had people in that lot, and you took your turn, and they brought you around steel helmet get you went out, and shrapnel fell. There were trucks running up and down the rail on the railways with guns on. So of course shrapnel was falling everywhere. And we used to go down. By that time, of course, I was now about 16. I was working, and we used to come home, have dinner or supper or whatever we called it, and then you would undress and get into your pajamas and put pants and a jacket over that and go down into the shelter where we had bunks, and we'd sleep down there the whole night. Mm-hmm. And you come up in the morning and then get dressed and go to work. And it was strange, it was frightening to hear bombs come down because you learned a lot of bits and pieces. You knew that when you heard a bomb dropped far away, you counted each one 6 in a row. So you would hear, the second one was nearer, the third, the fourth, the fifth was very near, and then the 6th was that side, and you knew you were okay. And it is funny how we just live through it. You knew it was happening. You knew it was a strange way to live, but there was nothing else to do. So you sort of got on with it, there was, and the thing when I look back now, I think to myself that my teenage life, like when you're going out in the evenings because you're older, was finished because the whole place was totally blacked out. And no lights anywhere, so no one went out at night, and you were frightened because you went to a cinema, someone could drop a bomb, they could drop a bomb on it, and no one would know where you were. So all that passed, and then finally, because I got to 18 and I had to sign up either to do war work or go into one of the services, and because having a brother who was already in the Navy, I wanted to be in the Navy too. And so I joined the Wrens. And it took them nearly a year to sign me up. I was getting on almost 19 by the time I signed up. And I did a little early sort of instruction and stuff in London, because by this time I had been working for a chartered accountant, so I was going to be taken in as what they call a writer, someone who does office work. And after a sort of little instruction in London and getting your uniform and all that sort of thing, I was transferred down to Plymouth, and we were in a stationed in a large house in a private road. Every morning in the blackout, we used to have to go down through the port, get on a tender, and be taken out to the ship, which was actually a school for, can't think of what it was now. It was a training ship for the Navy. We were going on to do the office work on the ship. And we used to run down there, and we'd have to jump onto a floating, down the wet steps and onto a floating platform. And we used to get hauled onto this tender when the sailors were. We get hauled on head first, feet first, anything they could grab hold of. And we were in tight skirts, remember, and silk stockings. And in we'd go. And if you were late, you had to go later on the officers' boat. And there, when you got on, you got off at the officers' landing, and you walked up the stairs, a lone wren, and there was the officer of the day standing. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, sort of thing. But there were so many of us there. There was army stationed on the hills outside Plymouth. We were on the ship. By the way, I still have my cap band, which has HMS Defiance on it. And we just did normal days of work. Of course, Plymouth had been badly bombed just after the bombing stopped a bit in London or eased up. And so they had known a lot of air raids too. And you get the occasional one across the channel, because it's only 21 miles anyway, And we were just doing an office job, and mainly things were pretty quiet for a long time. But then, of course, when later on, a lot later on, when they started to do the invasion of France, when they started to land on the beaches, of course, the Americans had come in by then, and we saw all the boats in the harbour. The harbour was crowded with not boats, ships. And we got up on the 6th of June and they'd all gone. We knew it was happening. We had known most it was going to happen. But it was a strange feeling to think they were all out there.
And to go back a bit to what I had asked Granddad was that the when the war first started with Germany, a lot of people thought back to the First World War, where it was most of it was taking place in trenches in France, and I don't think people really thought of the possibility that Germany was capable, or that hadn't really happened, or that wasn't really a reality that was anticipated, that Germany could conquer the entirety of France.
No, because they had the Maginot Line, and they thought that was going to stop them. They had they had pinned all their faith mostly on that, and of course they had occupied Holland and Belgium, and they had just massed so many troops. And what did they do? They went round the end of the Maginot Line and came in anyway. And of course, that was when the army, the British army and the French army fought them, but they were gradually pushed back, and of course, finally they were on the coast at Dunkirk. And that's when they had to do the big evacuation, the rescue with all the small boats. The men, every man on the east coast of Britain who had a boat, a holiday, a yacht, anything, went across and got the men off as much as they could. But of course they lost thousands. And it was a terrible time.
So when you joined the Wrens and you made that sort of transition, like you were saying, I mean, you were a teenager.
Yes.
And how were you able to transition from, going to be a teenager and, going out every night or being with friends to being involved in something like that?
Well, as I say, as a teenager, we'd never been out every night with friends because of the blackout and the bombing.
Yeah.
So I always think I was 18, as I say, getting on for 19, only a few months short of 19 by the time I went. And I'd never been away from home before, alone, without my parents. And I think I grew up, I was a different person when I came home after 3 years away, living with other people my age and in a very different circumstances. And, we had meals that you got perfectly tired of them, of course, because they were so often the same. But you knew that people at home, I knew my stepmother was having to go and line up for food. And I remember going home on leave one time and she was thrilled to bits because she had got a can of corned beef. And we had it so often, we used to mostly throw it away, and I felt so bad. But these things happened, I mean, people at home, the ordinary people, especially the women trying to cook and provide meals, had it very difficult. And then, of course, after all the main bombing was over, there came the starving. People used to have to queue up with their ration books to get meat and stay in the queue as long as there was some still to be doled out and be able to be bought, of course. And they used to do daylight raids then and run down the lines with machine guns from the planes. They died very low. There was all sorts of stuff going on.
And the transition, during the war from Neville Chamberlain to Winston Churchill. That's kind of classically thought that Neville Chamberlain had the policy of appeasement
Yes,
toward
the poor
Hitler.
man, everyone laughs at the way he tried, and he said, we'll have peace in our time, and made fun of him. But they were very glad to think that they might have peace in their time if he could achieve it. Mm-hmm. He was considered weak and had not stood up to Hitler, but he was trying to stop our country going to the war because he knew very well that we were totally unprepared. Totally unprepared. I don't know how many planes we had at the beginning. It was ridiculous. And but I don't think I really heard a great deal against Churchill. I'm sure there were some people who didn't like him, but he was a born leader. He was a born leader. He was able to make you believe that because we were fighting something truly wicked, when we'd heard about the camps and the Jewish people and all the rest of it, and he was able to make you believe that because we were fighting sheer wickedness, we had to win, and we would. And he literally was a man made for the moment, like Roosevelt was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He was a leader that needed to be there at that time. I think, I can remember that when he was due to make a speech on the radio, no one was in the street. Everyone was indoors listening. It was, if you went out in the street, even if it was still light, everyone had hurried home from work to hear it. It was considered so important to hear what he had to say.
After France had been knocked out of the war, and it had really just been Britain and Germany, and Hitler had been unable to break, the Royal Air Force, and certainly Germany did not have the naval power to overtake England.
Well, they weren't too badly off, but they sewed the channel with so many mines. As I say, that was my brother. He was on a fishing trawler, only 13 crew, and they were out there through the minefields, to sort of get them blown up and taken out. But you see, we had faced each other before. I mean, you probably know what Churchill said. We'll fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them in the towns. We'll fight them in the hills. And we all cheerfully believed that. We knew their army was much bigger than they had much more manpower and weapon power than us at that time. I mean, but there were men in what they called the what did they call it? The local men who were too old to go into the army, to be called up, and they had like the home army. I can't remember what
Home Guard.
The Home Guard, thank you, Deborah, that's right. And the Home Guard. These guys, they had things like rakes and shovels and things like that. And they were prepared to stand on the cliffs or on the beaches, and make a stand. It was ridiculous when you really come to think of it, but the spirit was very high. The spirit was really high. It was probably absolutely ridiculous, but I never saw that spirit drop or falter, I should say, not actually drop, but falter until they sent over the buzz bombs, unmanned bombs. And they were so demoralizing because you could hear them coming. They made a certain sound and everyone knew the sound. And you could hear them coming for miles. And they would come closer and closer and closer. And suddenly the engine would cut off. And you had no way of knowing which way they were going to come down, this way, that way, whatever. And they were very demoralizing. I mean, you had no protection against them whatsoever. And, but that, as I say, that was really the only time I saw morale really falter a bit in London anyway. But again, they picked themselves up and said, well, you know, another thing. And of course, that was getting close to the end of the war.
And did that more, because obviously militarily, I mean, the United Kingdom was, you know, receiving, you know, material support from the United States,
yes,
but
and we would not have got through without that. I mean, Churchill really begged for that. He lowered himself to beg because he knew we had no other way of winning.
And that's sort of,
that's why and Roosevelt understood what he was saying, but of course many of the senators here were against it. They didn't want to be involved, and it was through Roosevelt and his efforts that they received the stuff we received the stuff we did receive.
And that sort of, that massive superiority that, you know, the Wehrmacht had, all the tanks and the manpower, and just, you know, at that time, you know, Germany's army was probably the most well-organized in the world. And
yes, and I mean, after all, you know, he'd been in Austria a good time. He had people from Austria. They were called up into his army. We were fighting in so many areas. They were in South Africa, you know, and it was very spread out, and we were spread very thin. And it was very critical, believe me.
And I asked Grandad this, and, you know, to the sort of complete amazement, you know, to most of his generals as well, he had, you know, sort of Britain backed into that corner, but he completely turned around and, you know, decided to go, I guess, the way of Napoleon and invade the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union. Well, as I say, as Grandad said, people couldn't believe their luck because we thought he was right on the edge of landing on our shores. And it would have been almost impossible to stop him. I don't know why. No one could make out why he suddenly made that decision. And of course, when they got into the winter in Russia, half those poor devils didn't have the right equipment or the clothes. He lost thousands of men in the just through the weather. So, but as I say, for us, it was a break.
Mm. So getting towards the end of the war, when the tide began to turn against Germany and the massive superiority they once had, was, you know, their resources were dwindling and they no longer had the edge they did. Yeah. What did it feel like, I guess, I think when, you know, Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States had entered the war,
yes.
I think, you know, Churchill said something to the effect of, you know, we've won after all.
Yes.
And how did you and anyone around you feel about that?
We all knew that with the help of, we had thousands of American soldiers, you know, in there waiting to make the effort to go across for D-Day. And we knew that just that amount of men and planes and everything they had was going to make a big difference. You know, everyone was glad to welcome the Americans because we knew that without them, we possibly wouldn't have made it. I doubt if we would have made it. I mean, we were a small country. We were turning out armaments as much as we could, but you know, when you measure the size of the armaments and factories and stuff we had to what Germany had, and were able to have their countries that they conquered already make, it was getting worse, really. But on the other hand, I don't think people really sort of. There was always that feeling we'll win because we have to win.
Mm.
I guess it's. I think your grandfather mentioned the word arrogance, and in a way, I think it was an arrogance. You know, it's in the same way that all the time you were in the service, I don't think anybody ever thought what they would do after the war. You didn't think ahead. You lived it day by day. It was the same. It was the same in the bombing. You lived day by day. You took one day at a time, and you just dealt with what came each day as best you could. And that seemed to be the general feeling.
Towards the end of the war, you know, when it was pretty much already over, and I had asked Granddad, you know, Hitler was, you know, obviously there was more to, you know, Nazi Germany than Hitler, but he was very much, you know, the soul of it.
Oh, yes.
And when he had killed himself, you know, as the Red Army was approaching, and when that news broke, what was that like for you and people you knew?
Very cheerful.
I'd imagine so, yeah.
I say, good, at least we got rid of the worst one, you know. Everyone was saying, well, you know, well, did they see his body? Are they sure he just didn't get away, you know? And, but no, of course, you couldn't help being delighted because for us, he was the epitome of so much sheer wickedness. We looked on him like that, as if he was thoroughly evil, which he was. I still think so. And you know, well, I think a lot of people would like to have seen him sort of captured and sort of had it like a public thing so that everyone could relish it, which is a terrible word, but they would have done. But the fact that it had happened, you could only say to yourself, thank God the world's rid of that, you know.
At the end, after, I mean, people had obviously known the treatment, you know, of unwanted minorities in Germany, and people had known for a long time what the policy of the Nazis was towards the Jews, but it wasn't until, you know, after Germany, most of Germany had been defeated, that I think people knew the actual extent.
The extent of it, no one did. Jews, the Gypsies, and a lot of religious people. It was incredible. Well, they said, you know, that the troops that went in, as they went through the gates and saw the condition of these walking skeletons, you know, the men were crying. They couldn't stop it because it was so appalling. And they had to, you know, the Americans so much wanted to help, and they had to stop them giving these people food because they just, certain types of food, you know, they wanted to give them everything they had, but they just couldn't cope with it. They were literally, oh, it was terrible. And my father insisted that we listen to the reports coming in on the radio. He said, you need to hear this. You need to know what was happening so that it will never happen again. I hated hearing about it. But you know, there was nothing else. It was terrible, appalling what they found.
And I asked Grandad this as well, and while this was removed, obviously, from the European theater, what was it like to hear about the use of an atomic bomb?
You know, I don't remember a lot. I don't think we liked the idea that it had been used against civilians. Hiroshima and what's the other one?
Nagasaki?
Yeah, Nagasaki. Yeah. And it didn't seem to be right to use such an appalling weapon against open cities. And I think we all worried that this is some terrible thing now that has come into the world. And you know, everyone will soon know. You know what happens. A thing is produced, and very soon, many people can produce it, and there it is. It's a weapon that exists. So I think we were rather astonished about it, more than anything. You know, I mean, many people hated, especially the Japanese, for what had happened to the men in Burma, the Burma Road and all that sort of thing. And you knew that they had been a great deal of cruelty from their armies to prisoners. So you didn't respect those, but these were people, you know. These were ordinary citizens. And it just didn't seem right.
So when the war was over, and you had mentioned that you had mentioned that no one really knew sort of what they were going to do next, and it was, but how did you, from being in the Wrens to transitioning back into civilian life and to sort of, I guess, rebuild, and how, well, for you or your family or your friends or anyone you knew, just describe what that was like, I guess going home. Or
well, of course, you always wanted to go home. I mean, home is home.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, 1946 before I got out. So I was just short of 22. And I'm ready to have a good time. And because living in London, my good friend that had joined the Wrens at the same time as we'd asked if we could be sent together, somewhere. And the answer to that was that I went as far south as I could go to Plymouth, and they sent her to the Orkney Islands off Scotland. So we'd seen each other a couple of times on leave during the war. And it was just great to think you would be living a normal life again. You could go out in the evening, you could go to the theatre, you could go dancing. I mean, I suddenly picked up teenage life, And food was still very short, and rationing went on for years in Britain. No one seems to know that here, but it did. Your mum, Deborah, when she was a year old, we still had a ration card. Deborah had a ration card. It was only for really mostly meat and bacon and stuff like that. But and when the candy was rationed, you had to give up tickets for candy. Everything was rationed. And I can remember going into a store and saying, chocolate's not rationed anymore. So she said behind the counter, no, that's right. So I said, well, may I have a bar of whatever it was? And she handed me the bar. She said, do you want another one? And my mouth dropped. I couldn't believe I was able to get 2 small bars of chocolate at once. So lots of things. It sort of it was a total difference, but somehow you slid back into it. I suppose gradually, but we were young, and you just were glad to. You were out of uniform now, and you could buy a few clothes, and it was life just gradually becoming a normal life again. And you look back and you thought, well, it's so different. You just hadn't we hadn't experienced it. Me really from the time I was 15 until I was 22. It was 7 years really, out of your life, and everything had been short and hard to get, and you just did without because you knew everyone was doing without. But it was very nice to be able to get a little luxury here and there again when we got back.
And finally, I guess to close it, and what do you feel you most took from that experience? It can be, just positive or negative, that sort of defined you as a person, that left an impression on you.
For me, I was very, very unsure of myself when I went into the service. I had never sort of been away from home. I'd always been living with my parents, of course, as we all were in those days. And I wasn't a very definite person. I sort of stood back a good deal. And then I went into the service, and I was stationed with all sorts of people, girls who came from fishing villages and actually manned all the boats in the harbour and that sort of thing, which I envied them, but of course they knew how to handle boats. And also, the girl in the next bed might be the Right Honourable Lady something or other. I was dealing with all sorts of people, and it began to impinge upon my mind, but my mind was as good as most of theirs. And I mean, I don't think I got arrogant, but I began to realise that I was a person and I was entitled to my own ideas and feelings. So it kind of a growing up took a long time, but I was very different as a person, as I say, when I came out and went back home to the girl who had left. I'd grown up.
And I guess, do you any last thing to say to close it out about that, or?
No, I don't think so. I hope you get pleasure from it. I mean, I know I've rambled a bit, but no, I don't really have any. I was very glad to see it finish, and knew that, as I say, that the men of my father's generation hated the idea that they'd gone through one, and here it was so soon after. 20 years, wasn't it? It finished in 1918, and the next one started in 1939, so 21 years. It's not long to go between massive wars like that. And so, of course, we hoped there would never be another one, which shows you how stupid we were. I hope there is never another world war. That's all.
And thank you very much for sitting down and talking. Thank you. And
you know me, I like to talk.